September 1st, 1939. At 4:45 in the morning, German guns opened fire on Westerplatte, and the same day, aircraft were striking targets across Poland. Within weeks, Poland had ceased to exist as a nation, and within 6 years, tens of millions of people were dead. That is how the shooting started, but the war itself began years earlier, built from warnings that went unheeded, borders that were tested and found soft, alliances that crumbled under pressure, and leaders who kept telling themselves that each new crisis could be contained before it spread. And that pattern is exactly why the question hanging over the world right now deserves a serious answer. Could another world war begin the same way, not with a single dramatic declaration, but with separate crises that slowly connect until the connections can no longer be broken? A war in Ukraine has already redrawn the security map of Europe in ways that would have seemed unthinkable a decade ago. A confrontation with Iran carries the potential to ignite the Persian Gulf, choke off the Strait of Hormuz, and send shockwaves through the global economy. A crisis over Taiwan could pull the United States and China into direct conflict before either side had fully decided to fight. Behind all three of those pressure points sit the same forces that made the 1930s so combustible. Revisionist powers willing to redraw borders by force, exhausted democracy struggling to sustain their commitments, alliances cracking under economic strain, propaganda poisoning the information space, and a widespread belief that catastrophe is always avoidable, right up until the moment it arrives. The people living through the 1930s did not believe they were sleepwalking into disaster, and that is the most unsettling part of the comparison. Manchuria felt far away. Ethiopia read as someone else's problem. The Rhineland seemed like a risk not worth taking a stand over. Austria got treated as a special case. The Sudetenland became a compromise, and the compromise was celebrated. Poland, finally, was the line. But by the time that line got drawn, drawing it no longer changed the outcome. This documentary traces how World War II actually began, not only on the battlefield, but inside diplomatic failures, economic pressures, and the kind of miscalculation that compounds quietly until it cannot be reversed. From there, the question becomes whether that same pattern is taking shape again today. In Ukraine, in Iran, around Taiwan, across the South China Sea, and inside the alliances that were built to hold the world together and are now being tested in ways their architects never planned for. None of this is a prediction, and it is not meant as one. What it is a warning, because if another world war begins, it will not announce itself by that name. It will start as a border incursion, or a missile strike, or a proxy attack, or a blockade, or a mistake that nobody intended, but nobody managed to stop. Only later, once the alliances have activated and the great powers have been pulled in past the point of withdrawal, will people look back at the sequence of events and ask how the signs were so visible and so thoroughly ignored. To understand how World War II began, you must first understand what came before it. Not the treaties, not the borders drawn at Versailles. You must understand the exhaustion. The First World War had ended in November 1918 after 4 years of industrialized slaughter. 17 million people were dead. The survivors, governments, armies, ordinary families, emerged from that catastrophe with a single, overwhelming desire: never again. This was not a political slogan. It was a psychological wound. The men who sat in European parliaments in the 1920s had buried their sons, their brothers, their fathers. The populations they governed had lived through food shortages, poison gas attacks, and years of mass bereavement. The result was a political culture built on the assumption, the desperate, necessary assumption, that another great war was simply unacceptable. And because it was unacceptable, it was treated in key corridors of power as impossible. This was the first condition for catastrophe. A world that had been so badly hurt by conflict that it refused to believe conflict could return. The second condition was economic. The Great Depression, which began in 1929, did not merely impoverish nations. It delegitimized the political systems that had failed to prevent it. Across Europe and Asia, democratic governments that could not feed their people became vulnerable to movements that promised order, national pride, and decisive action. In Germany, unemployment reached 30%. In that climate, a political party that offered simple answers to complex humiliations, the Nazi Party, won mass support, not despite its extremism, but in many cases because of it. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. He had not seized power. He had been handed it by politicians who believed they could control him. This was the third condition, the fatal miscalculation of those who thought a dangerous man could be managed. Over the next 6 years, Germany remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and absorbed the Sudetenland. At each step, the Western democracies, Britain and France above all, had choices. And at each step, they chose accommodation over confrontation. The most famous act of accommodation came in Munich in September 1938. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, after meeting with Hitler, returned to London waving an agreement and declaring that it represented peace for our time. Czechoslovakia, which had not been invited to the conference, was told to surrender its western borderlands or face abandonment. It surrendered. 6 months later, Germany occupied the rest of the country. Chamberlain was not a coward. He was not a fool. He was a man who had lived through one catastrophic war and believed, with sincere conviction, that almost anything was preferable to another. He miscalculated not because he was irrational, but because he applied rational logic to an adversary who did not share his assumptions. Hitler interpreted each concession not as evidence of Western moderation, but as proof of Western weakness. Each time he advanced and faced no serious resistance, his confidence grew. By the time Britain and France resolved to fight over Poland in September 1939, it was far harder than it would have been in 1936, or even 1938. The lesson embedded in this sequence is one of the most difficult in all of political life. The conditions that produce catastrophic war are often created by people trying desperately to avoid it. Now consider the present. Since the end of the Cold War in 1991, much of the Western world has lived through a period of relative security that produced a psychology strikingly similar to post-1918 exhaustion. After the grinding wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, after years of economic instability following the 2008 financial crisis, democratic societies turned inward, reducing defense spending, ending foreign entanglements, assuming the rules-based international order would sustain itself without constant investment. Defense budgets in NATO's European members fell sharply through the 1990s and 2000s. As late as 2021, fewer than 10 of NATO's 30 members were meeting the alliance's 2% spending target. A strategic culture of disengagement had taken hold, not through malice, but through the natural human preference for peace over preparation. And in that interval of reduced vigilance, certain powers were watching, and certain powers were planning. The question is, what did they see? In the years immediately following the First World War, Germany was a defeated, humiliated nation. Its military restricted, its territory stripped, its economy burdened by reparations it could barely afford. Millions of ethnic Germans now lived outside its borders. Nazi propaganda transformed this humiliation into a mythology of national rebirth. Germany had not truly lost on the battlefield, the story went. It had been stabbed in the back by internal enemies. Restoring its rightful place in the world was not aggression, it was justice. This narrative of grievance as justification is the signature of revisionist powers, states that seek to overturn the existing international order rather than operate within it. Germany was the defining revisionist power of the 1930s. It was joined by Imperial Japan in Asia, which had its own narrative of racial destiny and imperial expansion, and by Fascist Italy, which dreamed of reconstructing a Mediterranean empire along Roman lines. Together, formally allied by the Tripartite Pact of 1940, they shared one fundamental conviction: the existing international order was illegitimate, and force was an acceptable means of changing it. Now examine the present. Russia, under Vladimir Putin, has constructed a remarkably similar narrative over 2 decades. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which Putin has publicly called the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, is framed not as historical transition, but as historic injustice. Russians living in former Soviet republics are described as a separated people awaiting reunion. NATO's expansion eastward is portrayed not as a defensive alliance's voluntary growth, but as aggression against Russia's rightful sphere of influence. In February 2022, Russian forces invaded Ukraine. The stated justifications: denazification, protection of Russian speakers, prevention of NATO expansion, bore the unmistakable structure of grievance mythology. Elaborate rationales for a decision rooted in the belief that existing borders were illegitimate. The parallel with the 1930s is not exact. Putin is not Hitler. Russia in 2022 is not Germany in 1939. But the structural pattern: a major power with a grievance narrative, willing to use military force to revise the territorial order, testing whether the international community will resist or accommodate, is recognizable in ways that serious historians have not been slow to note. China presents a different but related profile. The Chinese Communist Party's official narrative centers on what it calls the century of humiliation, the period from the Opium Wars of the 1840s to the Communist victory in 1949, during which China was dominated, carved up, and humiliated by foreign powers. Taiwan, which Beijing regards as a breakaway province that must eventually be reunited with the mainland, by force if necessary, is the most visible focal point of this revisionist ambition. China's military spending has increased dramatically over the past 2 decades. Its navy now rivals the United States Navy in the number of warships. It has constructed artificial islands in the South China Sea and equipped them with military installations, asserting sovereignty over waters claimed by 6 other nations. It signed what its leaders called a no-limits partnership with Russia, weeks before the invasion of Ukraine. Neither Russia nor China is operating in direct imitation of the 1930s. But both have concluded, for their own reasons, through their own histories, that the current international order is not one they are obligated to preserve. Both have demonstrated the will to use or threaten force to change it. And here is what history teaches about this moment. The critical question is not whether revisionist powers exist. They have always existed. The critical question is what the defenders of the existing order choose to do about them. In the 1930s, the defenders chose accommodation, and accommodation had consequences that no one in 1933 had fully imagined. What will the defenders choose now? On June 28, 1919, the representatives of 32 nations signed the Treaty of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. Embedded within that treaty was the Covenant of the League of Nations, the world's first serious attempt to build a system of collective security in which an attack on any one member would be treated as an attack on all. The idea was sound. The execution was fatal. The United States Senate refused to ratify the treaty, and America never joined. The institution designed to organize the collective defense of the democratic world was denied its most powerful potential member before it held its first meeting. Germany and the Soviet Union were initially excluded. Major powers pursued their own interests within the framework when convenient and ignored it when not. The League's first serious test came in 1931, when Japan invaded Manchuria and established a puppet state. The League commissioned a report, issued a condemnation, and did nothing of consequence. Japan kept Manchuria. The message to every revisionist government was clear. The collective security architecture had no teeth. In 1935, Mussolini's Italy invaded Ethiopia, a League member. Sanctions were imposed but quietly undermined by private negotiations. Ethiopia was conquered. When Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland the following year, a direct violation of both Versailles and the Locarno Pact, his generals were under orders to retreat at the first sign of French resistance. France hesitated. Britain counseled caution. The League issued statements. Hitler advanced. The pattern became self-reinforcing. Each time the collective security system failed to act, it became less credible. Each time it became less credible, revisionist powers grew bolder. Now examine the present. The United Nations was designed with the lessons of the 1930s explicitly in mind. Its Security Council was given real enforcement powers, but also a veto structure. The 5 permanent members, including Russia and China, can each block any binding resolution. The result has been structural paralysis on precisely the issues that matter most. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the Security Council convened emergency sessions. Russia vetoed a resolution condemning the invasion. The General Assembly passed a non-binding resolution demanding Russian withdrawal, with 141 nations in favor. The invasion continued. NATO provided Ukraine with weapons, intelligence, and economic support. But the alliance was careful to frame its involvement as support for a partner rather than direct military engagement. The stated rationale was preventing escalation. The underlying concern was nuclear deterrence. Russia had nuclear weapons, and its government had made explicit threats about their use. This is where the present moment diverges most sharply from the 1930s. And it is important to be precise. Nuclear weapons genuinely change the calculus of great power confrontation. The risk of catastrophic escalation creates real constraints that did not exist in 1938. A direct NATO-Russia military engagement would carry risks with no historical equivalent. But that calculus cuts in multiple directions. The same fear of escalation that restrains NATO from decisive action may also have enabled the aggression it was meant to deter. If a revisionist power calculates, correctly or incorrectly, that its nuclear arsenal will paralyze its adversaries, deterrence runs backward. Rather than preventing aggression, the fear of escalation licenses it. This is not a new observation. Strategists made it during the Cold War. But in an era of multiple nuclear-armed revisionist states operating simultaneously, it has acquired a new and urgent relevance. Whether collective security can function under these conditions remains one of the defining unanswered questions of our time. Not all crises are created equal. Some unfold in remote places over obscure disputes that major powers find easy to ignore. Others erupt at the precise intersections of geography, resources, and strategic interest where ignoring them becomes impossible. World War II's geography was not accidental. The crises that triggered it, Manchuria, Ethiopia, the Rhineland, Austria, the Sudetenland, Poland, were probes, each chosen because the revisionist powers calculated the defenders would hesitate. And in each case, they were right. When Hitler chose to remilitarize the Rhineland in March 1936, his generals were under orders to retreat if France intervened. There were not enough troops, and the equipment was insufficient. Hitler later admitted the 48 hours after the operation were the most nerve-wracking of his life. A single French division moving east could have ended his gamble. France did not intervene. Today's geography carries its own strategic logic. Taiwan sits 90 miles off the coast of mainland China. close enough to be an unmistakable symbol of the Chinese Communist Party's unfinished national project, and important enough in terms of advanced semiconductor manufacturing to be of enormous strategic consequence. A Chinese seizure of Taiwan would not merely reunify a disputed territory. It would shift the balance of technological and military power across the Indo-Pacific in ways American planners regard as potentially decisive. Ukraine occupies an analogous position in Europe. Its Western orientation, its desire to align with the European Union and eventually NATO, directly contradicted Russia's conception of its own security perimeter. Its territory served as a buffer between Russia and NATO's eastern flank. That is why it became the site of confrontation rather than some other border dispute in some other corner of the world. The Baltic states present a different kind of vulnerability. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are NATO members, but their populations include significant Russian-speaking minorities, and their eastern borders are barely distinguishable from the pre-1991 Soviet frontier. In any serious deterioration of NATO-Russia relations, they are where strategic ambiguity becomes most dangerous. The South China Sea carries roughly 1/3 of all global maritime trade. China has asserted sovereignty over most of it through what it calls a 9-dash line, a claim a 2016 International Arbitration Tribunal ruled had no basis in international law. China ignored the ruling. The Korean Peninsula, meanwhile, remains technically in a state of armistice. North Korea has developed nuclear weapons and the missiles to deliver them, and its collapse or defeat would trigger consequences. A power vacuum, a refugee crisis, a new border between American forces and China that Beijing regards as existential. These flashpoints are not isolated. They are interconnected, each shaping the calculations of actors in all the others, just as the crises of the 1930s were interconnected. Japanese expansion in Asia consumed British attention that might otherwise have deterred Hitler. Italian adventurism in Africa absorbed French diplomatic energy. The revisionist powers understood without formally coordinating that simultaneous pressure across multiple theaters would fracture the defenders' capacity to respond to any one of them. That lesson has been absorbed. Chinese officials studied the Western response to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine with extraordinary attention, not as observers, but as potential actors facing their own version of the same strategic moment. How far would the West go to defend a partner? How effective were sanctions? How quickly could weapons be supplied? How long could democratic publics sustain support for a distant conflict? The answers were filed away. In strategic planning offices in Beijing, the implications were almost certainly discussed. What those discussions concluded, no one outside the room can say. But the questions being asked were the same questions German strategists asked in the mid-1930s. And the answers they received then shaped decisions that shook the world. But the fault lines of a potential Third World War are not confined to Eastern Europe or the Indo-Pacific. There is a third theater, older in some ways, more volatile in others, where the logic of escalation plays out in real time, almost daily. A theater whose consequences, if ignited, would be felt not in a single region, but across the entire global economy within hours. The Middle East. And at its center, a confrontation between the United States and Iran that has simmered since 1979 and, in recent years, has begun to boil. Enmity by itself is not war. What transforms enmity into catastrophe is what the 1930s teach us to watch for. The accumulation of provocations, the erosion of red lines, and the moment when one miscalculation triggers a chain of events no one fully intended and no one can fully control. In recent years, the exchange of military strikes between the United States and Iran, direct and through proxies, has escalated in ways that would have been considered extraordinary a decade ago. American forces have struck Iranian-backed militia positions across Iraq and Syria. Iran has launched drone and missile barrages that have struck Israeli territory directly, the first such attack in modern history. Iranian proxies have targeted American military installations with a frequency that has become almost routine. And in that routinization lies a particular danger. When the extraordinary becomes ordinary, the threshold for the truly catastrophic quietly descends. The January 2020 killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani by American drone strike in Baghdad brought the two countries to the edge of open war within hours. Iran's retaliatory ballistic missile strikes on American bases in Iraq were the largest direct Iranian military attack on American forces in history. That no Americans were killed, whether by Iranian design or fortune remains debated, was the difference between a crisis managed and a crisis that consumed everything around it. That margin was extraordinarily thin, and thin margins do not remain thin forever. To understand why a war between the United States and Iran would carry consequences far beyond their bilateral enmity, you must understand a narrow strip of water, barely 21 miles across at its narrowest point, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. The Strait of Hormuz. Every supertanker moving crude oil from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran itself must transit this strait. The liquefied natural gas that heats European homes and powers Asian economies flows through it. Close the strait through naval blockade, mining, or the anti-ship missiles positioned along Iran's coastline. And the global economy does not merely slow down, it seizes. Oil prices would spike to levels that would make the 1973 Arab oil embargo look like a brief inconvenience. Supply chains dependent on Middle Eastern energy would fracture. Inflation would detonate across every economy on Earth simultaneously. The damage would be felt not in weeks, but in hours. Iran has understood this for decades. Its military doctrine explicitly identifies the strait as a lever of strategic power, a means by which a country with a fraction of America's conventional strength can impose costs on the entire international community. It is asymmetric deterrence at geographic scale, and in the strategic logic of the present moment, it is the equivalent of the Rhineland, the Sudetenland, and the Pacific simultaneously. A single choke point whose closure would force every major power on Earth to choose a side. That is what draws in actors far beyond Tehran and Washington. China imports more than 40% of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Any disruption strikes directly at the economic stability on which the Chinese Communist Party's domestic legitimacy rests. Beijing has responded by cultivating its relationship with Tehran, becoming Iran's largest oil customer, even as Western sanctions attempted to strangle Iranian revenues, and brokering a surprising diplomatic agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia in 2023. China is present in this theater not as a bystander, but as a stakeholder. Russia, too, has deepened its ties with Tehran. Russian-supplied air defense systems have entered Iran's military inventory. Iranian drones have been deployed against Ukrainian cities in sufficient quantities to reshape the battlefield in Eastern Europe. The relationship between Moscow and Tehran is not a formal alliance, but it is a functional partnership built on shared hostility toward American power and shared interest in demonstrating the limits of Western reach. What emerges from this geometry is exactly the kind of multi-actor alignment that made the conflicts of the 1930s so difficult to contain. Japan, Germany, and Italy were not operating from a single command, but their overlapping interests and simultaneous pressure across multiple fronts fractured the capacity of the democratic powers to respond coherently to any one of them. The same fracture point exists today. A military confrontation in the Persian Gulf would not occur in isolation. It would occur against the backdrop of an ongoing war in Ukraine, rising tensions across the Taiwan Strait, and a global information environment in which the narrative of any escalation would be contested before the first shot had stopped echoing. Can NATO maintain focus on Eastern Europe while managing a Middle Eastern crisis? Can American planners credibly deter China over Taiwan while projecting force in the Persian Gulf? Can the democratic alliance system hold coherence across multiple simultaneous theaters of pressure? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the operational questions being asked in military planning cells right now. The British Empire of the 1930s was a global power stretched across multiple theaters. And that very overextension, combined with insufficient will and insufficient resources to defend everywhere, contributed to the paralysis that made appeasement seem like the only available option. Overextension is not merely a military problem, it is a political one. Populations asked to sustain commitments across multiple distant theaters, threatened in ways they imperfectly understand, through an information environment they can no longer trust. Are populations at risk of demanding retreat at exactly the moment when retreat most resembles surrender? And yet, the most dangerous element of the Iran-United States confrontation may not be the scale of any individual attack. It is the structure of the escalation cycle itself. Neither side has wanted full-scale war. Both have consistently calibrated their responses. America to avoid triggering retaliation, requiring further escalation. Iran to demonstrate resolve without crossing thresholds it cannot survive. Both believe they understand where the other's true red lines are. And that belief is precisely the condition that has produced wars throughout history. Not wars that were wanted, but wars that were stumbled into. Each party convinced it understood the other's limits, discovering only in the aftermath that it had been wrong. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June 1914 was not supposed to start a world war. The chain of events that followed moved faster than any of its architects anticipated, and the mechanisms expected to stop it. Diplomacy, back channels, monarchs telegraphing each other, proved wholly inadequate to the momentum already in motion. Escalation ladders do not stop climbing simply because the people on them want to get off. A strike that kills Iranian military personnel of sufficient seniority. A retaliatory strike that kills American service members in numbers that cannot be absorbed politically. A congressional demand for a response that a president cannot refuse. An Iranian move to close the strait that invites a naval response. A naval exchange in confined waters that produces casualties on both sides. A regional power, Israel, Saudi Arabia, a Hezbollah armed with Iranian precision missiles, entering the conflict because its own calculus has shifted. Each step individually manageable, collectively irreversible. This is not a prediction. It is a pattern, and it is a pattern with a historical name. A conflict that no one chose, that everyone helped to create. The Persian Gulf today is not Danzig in 1939. Iran is not Nazi Germany. And the United States, for all its difficulties, is not the exhausted, overextended Britain of Neville Chamberlain. But the underlying dynamic, the cycle of provocation and response, geography as force multiplier, regional conflicts drawing in global powers through overlapping interests and interlocking commitments, is recognizable. Profoundly, uncomfortably recognizable. By the time a regional confrontation has drawn in enough actors, destabilized enough economic systems, and shattered enough of the assumptions on which order rested, the question of whether it was supposed to become a world war becomes irrelevant. It already is one. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. A world war does not need more space than that to begin. There is a comfortable theory, held by many economists and political scientists, that economic interdependence makes war between major powers essentially impossible. When nations trade heavily with each other, they have powerful incentives to avoid conflict. Rational actors therefore choose commerce over combat. It is a reassuring theory, and it has been falsified before. In 1914, Britain and Germany were each other's second-largest trading partners. Their royal families were related by blood. None of it stopped the war. In the years before 1941, American oil and scrap metal were flowing to Japan even as relations deteriorated. fueling the military expansion that would eventually destroy American warships at Pearl Harbor. The economic relationship did not prevent the conflict. In some respects, it may have enabled it. Today, the economic interdependence between China and the United States dwarfs any historical precedent. Bilateral trade has in recent years exceeded $600 billion annually. American consumers rely on Chinese manufacturing for an extraordinary range of goods. Chinese investors hold significant portions of American treasury debt. The supply chains for the most strategically critical technologies, advanced semiconductors, rare earth elements, run directly through China or territories it claims. This interdependence is real, but it is not a guarantee of peace. It is a complicating factor with its own dangers. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated how quickly interconnection can transmit catastrophic instability across borders. A serious military confrontation involving China would not merely disrupt trade. It would trigger supply chain collapses, financial panics, and economic damage affecting every nation on Earth. The very interdependence that theoretically prevents conflict would, if conflict occurred, massify its destruction. There is also a subtler risk. Economic interdependence creates leverage, and leverage can be weaponized. Russia's use of natural gas as a tool of political coercion over European countries showed clearly that economic relationships are not merely commercial. They are instruments of power. China's willingness to use trade restrictions against countries that displease Beijing, Australia, Lithuania, South Korea, suggests the same logic applies on a far larger scale. And the economic conditions within major powers matter as well. The Great Depression did not cause World War II by itself, but it created the soil in which the decisions that led to war were made, reducing the political cost of aggression and raising the political cost of resistance. Today's stresses are different in character but recognizable in effect. Pandemic-driven inflation, an energy shock from the Russia-Ukraine war, political polarization in the United States at levels not seen since the 1930s, a real estate debt crisis and high youth unemployment in China that create the kind of domestic pressure that has historically led authoritarian governments to seek external distraction. None of this makes war inevitable, but it creates an environment in which miscalculation becomes more likely, in which leaders face stronger incentives to take risks, and in which populations that should be demanding diplomacy may instead be demanding confrontation. The parallel is imperfect, but it is present, and the question it raises deserves to be asked out loud. What happens to the peace between interconnected economies when the interconnection itself becomes a source of vulnerability rather than a guarantee of stability? In the early 1930s, Joseph Goebbels became head of Germany's newly created Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. His mandate was not merely to distribute Nazi ideology. It was to reshape the information environment in which German citizens lived, to determine what they knew, what they believed, and what they feared. Every medium was a tool: radio, film, newspapers, public rallies. The goal was not simply to lie, though lying was employed. The deeper goal was to make truth irrelevant, to create a population so saturated with competing claims that it became susceptible to any movement promising clarity amid the confusion. The manufactured crisis, the delegitimization of independent media, the construction of alternative realities. These techniques have proven remarkably durable. Now consider the present information landscape. The internet and social media have created something Goebbels could not have imagined. An environment in which every individual is simultaneously a potential recipient and broadcaster of information, in which the distinction between fact and fabrication is systematically blurred, and in which algorithms designed to maximize engagement reliably surface the most extreme content. State-sponsored disinformation operations can now operate at a speed and reach no prior propaganda. apparatus could match Russian active measures, documented extensively by Western intelligence agencies, have deliberately amplified divisions within democratic societies, promoted fringe causes, and manufactured confusion about verifiable events. The goal is not to make populations believe any specific lie. It is to make them uncertain about everything, to produce an epistemological crisis in which the concept of shared factual reality becomes contested, and in which making informed collective decisions becomes extraordinarily difficult. In a crisis environment, a military confrontation, a rapidly evolving security situation, democratic governments depend on their ability to build public support quickly and credibly. If that ability has been preemptively degraded by years of disinformation, the capacity to respond effectively to genuine threats is directly compromised. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, a significant portion of the Western public doubted the documented evidence of Russian military involvement. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Russian state media broadcast an entirely alternative version of events to domestic and international audiences simultaneously. The information war was not separate from the kinetic conflict. It was integral to it. In the 1930s, the democracies faced propaganda. Today, they face a systematic assault on the shared epistemic foundations that make democratic decision-making possible. The populations that need to understand the stakes, demand preparedness, and support difficult choices are the same populations most exposed to that assault. There is one more dimension rarely discussed in polite company. The information war is not conducted only by adversaries. It is also conducted within democracies, by political actors who find it advantageous to deny inconvenient realities, to delegitimize institutions, and to treat the maintenance of alliances as a burden rather than an investment. In the 1930s, the most dangerous voices were the ones insisting that Hitler's demands were reasonable, that standing firm was warmongering, that the distant troubles of distant nations were none of anyone's business. Those voices exist again. They wear different clothes. They speak different languages. But the logic is the same. August 23rd, 1939. The world woke to news that stunned it. Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological enemies that had spent years denouncing each other as existential threats, had signed a non-aggression pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact also contained secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. The pact destroyed the last realistic hope of building a broad coalition to deter Hitler. France and Britain had been in negotiations with Moscow, hesitant, distrustful negotiations aimed at securing Soviet participation in collective defense. Those negotiations failed. Stalin, calculating that the Western powers would either capitulate again or exhaust themselves in a long war, chose the German deal. Hitler, freed from the threat of a two-front war, moved against Poland 9 days later. The failure to build that coalition was not inevitable. It was the product of specific decisions by specific people, negotiators who treated Soviet concerns with insufficient seriousness, a Stalin who doubted Western resolve after years of watching appeasement, leaders who could not reconcile themselves to the ideological compromises coalition building required. Catastrophes are rarely produced by fate. They are produced by the accumulation of individual choices, each one individually defensible, collectively disastrous. Now look at the present. The democratic alliance system, NATO, the US-Japan alliance, the US-South Korea treaty, the emerging partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, is both the world's most effective deterrent against large-scale conflict and its most fragile asset. NATO's credibility rests not merely on a legal commitment, but on a psychological reality. The credible belief that an attack on one member would genuinely be treated as an attack on all. When political leaders in member states question the alliance's value, suggest that defense commitments are conditional on financial contributions, or signal that some members matter more than others, they are not merely making political statements, they are altering the calculations of adversaries. In the 1930s, the most dangerous signals were those that told Hitler the democracies would not fight. The most dangerous signals today are those that tell revisionist powers the alliances will not hold. The stress points are visible. American debates about the cost of global commitments have intensified since the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. European NATO members have increased defense spending since 2022, but from a very low base. Whether NATO would actually invoke Article 5 over an ambiguous provocation, a cyber attack, a proxy incident, an incursion designed to fall below the threshold of obvious aggression, remains genuinely uncertain. In Asia, Japan has moved significantly toward rearmament and a more assertive security posture. Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States formed the AUKUS partnership, centered on nuclear-powered submarines for Australia, a clear signal of intent toward China. South Korea has deepened security cooperation with the United States and Japan, despite deep historical grievances between Seoul and Tokyo. But the fundamental question, what would the United States actually do if China moved militarily against Taiwan, remains deliberately unanswered. American policy of strategic ambiguity commits to helping Taiwan defend itself without committing explicitly to military intervention. It was designed to deter both Chinese aggression and unilateral Taiwanese moves toward formal independence. Whether that ambiguity still functions as a deterrent or whether it has become an invitation to miscalculation is one of the most consequential unresolved questions in contemporary geopolitics. In 1939, the moment of decision came too late. The months and years when a credible, unified response might have altered Hitler's calculations had already passed. By the time Poland was invaded, the choice was not between war and peace. It was between war now and war later, under worse conditions. History's question, the question every generation must answer for itself, is whether we can recognize the moment before the moment of no return has passed. On January 27, 1945, Soviet forces liberated the concentration and extermination camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. What they found there, the gas chambers, the crematoria, the warehouses of belongings, the survivors too weak to flee, became the most visceral symbol of what the failure to stop the war had ultimately cost. The post-war order that emerged, the United Nations, the Bretton Woods financial system, NATO, the European project, was constructed explicitly in the shadow of that cost. The people who built it had buried their parents and their children. They were not under any illusions about what failure meant. That generational memory is now fading. The last survivors of the Second World War are nearly all gone. The statesmen who built the post-war order are long dead. The populations of democratic societies are living at a distance from catastrophe that makes catastrophe genuinely difficult to believe in. This is not a failure of intelligence or compassion. It is a feature of human psychology. We respond to immediate threats, not distant ones. We are better at managing crises that have already arrived than preventing one still forming. The same cognitive patterns that allowed European populations to ignore the warning signs of the 1930s allow contemporary populations to dismiss the warning signs of the present. And yet the present situation is not a replay of the 1930s. It is a rhyme, not a repetition. Nuclear deterrence, for all its terrifying implications, has demonstrably prevented direct great power military conflict for 80 years. The economic integration of the world is more extensive than anything that existed before 1939. Democratic institutions under serious stress remain substantially more resilient than their interwar predecessors. The international laws and norms governing warfare, arms control, and human rights, imperfect and frequently violated, represent a body of accumulated understanding that simply did not exist in 1938. Germany and Japan, once the defining revisionist powers, are today among the most committed supporters of the rules-based system their predecessors tried to destroy. None of this guarantees peace. None of it means the pattern of the 1930s cannot reassert itself. But it means the outcome is not determined. It means the choices made now, by governments, by alliances, by citizens, matter. In 1936, France could have stopped Germany in the Rhineland at relatively low cost. In 1938, a unified Western response to the annexation of Austria or the Sudetenland might have shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility before it took hold. The war was not inevitable. It became inevitable because the decisions that might have prevented it were not made in time. The parallel in the present is not that war is coming. It is that the decisions that determine whether war comes, about defense investment, alliance solidarity, the credibility of deterrence, the information environments in which citizens make political choices, are being made right now, often without full awareness of their cumulative weight. History does not reward the passive. It does not distribute its consequences fairly between those who engaged with difficult realities and those who looked away. The nations that mobilized too late, that appeased too long, that assumed peace would sustain itself, they paid the same price as the nations that had always been in the crosshairs. Could World War III start the same way World War II did? The structures are present, the revisionist powers exist, the alliance systems are under stress, the information environments are degraded, the economic pressures are real, the collective security mechanisms are strained. But the ending of this story has not been written. It is being written now. In defense ministries and foreign offices, in the voting booths of democracies, in the decisions of alliance leaders, in the investments governments make in their own preparedness, and in the preparedness of their partners. The generation that built the post-war order had been educated by catastrophe. They knew what failure looked like because they had lived through it. We have not lived through it. That is our privilege. But privilege is not immunity. The future is not something that happens to us. It is something we choose. And the most dangerous choice of all is to assume that someone else will do the choosing. The time to act is always now. Because by the time the guns sound, the moment has already passed. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. If you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button, and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.